Hello, this is Dr. Laist. Today I'd like to talk about Flannery O'Connor's strange, unsettling story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, in terms of various thesis statements that we might articulate in the interests of critically examining the narrative's many ambiguities. Reading O'Connor's story for the first time can be a shocking experience. The story begins in what appears to be a comic mode. A family of 6 people are bickering with one another about the details of their coming road trip. We might expect a goofy family road trip comedy like Vacation or Little Miss Sunshine. By the end of the story, however, we have abruptly switched over into the horror genre as the family, including the children, the baby, and finally the grandmother, are executed one by one. We are disturbed, aghast, horrified. In our pain and confusion, we ask, why? Why, Misfit? Why, Flannery O'Connor? Why, God? As is true of life in general, there are many different ways of enjoying stories. One way is to allow the uncertainty, confusion, and horror to wash over you and to drift around in the beauty of the swirling current. Another way is to attempt to confront the uncertainty head-on and to channel it in a certain direction for the purpose of generating thoughts, ideas, and interpretations. When we take this more active approach to reading, we are moving toward an answer to the why question. The answer we decide upon becomes our thesis statement. First, let's consider the why question in its broadest sense. Why did the family get killed? The simplest answer is that there is no reason. Saying that the murder of the family happens for no reason is not a way of closing down the question. It is a positive solution to the problem. We conclude that A Good Man is Hard to Find is a story about a world in which innocent people are slaughtered for no reason. Once we come to this conclusion, we may want to hunt around in the story for other details that support our thesis. Directly after the family's car crashes, the children, John Wesley and June Starr, jump around shouting, "We've had an accident." The line is repeated 3 times, and the accident is in all caps each time, emphasizing the importance of this word to the story. An accident is something that happens for no reason, and the implication is that the family members are victims of a random, indifferent cosmos, devoid of justice or sympathy. Even more tellingly, when they encounter the Misfit, we find out that he calls himself the Misfit because, he explains, "I can't make what all I done wrong fit with all I gone through in punishment." His name doesn't merely refer, as we probably expect, to the idea that he is a social misfit, but to the fact that his punishment does not fit his crime. There is a misfit between the extent of his guilt and the severity of his sentence. Of course, the same is true of the family members, who are all flawed in venial ways, but who wind up suffering out of all proportion to what they deserve. Instead of logic and justice, the world seems to be governed by total accident. Finally, grandmother's willingness to speculate that Jesus didn't raise the dead may indicate that she recognizes that the world is devoid of miracles and transcendental meaning. Our thesis is that A Good Man is Hard to Find represents a nihilistic wasteland of pointless death. Then again, we might notice other details in the story that persuade us that the death of the family might actually be an expression of some underlying design. Our thesis might be that, although the children describe the car crash as an accident, the narrative represents the working of fate, pulling the grandmother and her family inexorably toward a date with their destiny. The most obvious piece of evidence for this interpretation would be the fact that the grandmother talks about the Misfit throughout the whole story, right from the first paragraph, and that, despite the enormity of the state of Florida, she manages to run smack dab into the escaped convict. When she does finally see him, O'Connor writes, "His face was as familiar to her as if she had known him all her life." The grandmother's apparent ability to predict that she would encounter the Misfit is amplified by the detail that, when she dressed for the road trip, she took precautions so that, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. If you read the story carefully, you will probably detect other details that foreshadow what lies ahead for the family. These details all work together to create a sense that this is a story about fate rather than chance. If we turn our attention to the details of how the car accident happened, we may notice the role the family played in their own demise. Of course, the grandmother's childishness, selfishness, and forgetfulness cause her to smuggle the cat pity thing into the car, to goad the children into demanding to see the house with the secret panel, and to cause Bailey to drive in what she knows is the wrong direction. factors which all play a role in the car crash, but we might also cite the children's brattiness, Bailey's spinelessness, and the mother's silence as contributing factors as well. If we make this argument, we may conclude that the family is responsible for their own deaths. Our thesis becomes that a good man is hard to find represents a world in which even petty sins are punished by a strict but watchful God who makes his presence felt through the workings of his divine plan. Turning our attention from the overall plot of the story to an analysis of the central character, we might consider the grandmother in terms of whether she is a flat or round character. One of the most significant features of a flat character is that they do not change over the course of the story, so we can ask of the grandmother whether she shows any signs of transformative self-awareness over the course of the story. The easiest thesis to defend in this regard may simply be to conclude that her behavior is just as selfish and manipulative at the end of the story as it is at the beginning, and that, consequently, she is a flat character. In the very first paragraph, we see her trying to convince the family to take the trip that she wants to take. Throughout the middle of the story, the attentive reader will find many other examples of the grandmother's manipulative behavior. Finally, confronted with the misfit, she pleads for her own life as the rest of her family is frog marched off into the woods and executed. She doesn't even seem to acknowledge what is happening to them. Her weird detachment from the horror unfolding before her may be interpreted as a sign of her continuing selfishness, while her pleading with the misfit about Jesus, rather than signifying authentic religiosity, may be interpreted as an extension of her previous acts of domestic manipulation. The misfit seems to conclude that the grandmother was indeed a flat character in his assessment that she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. According to our flat grandmother thesis, we can read this statement to mean that the grandmother was so committed to her selfish and manipulative ways that nothing less than death could cause her to change. On the other hand, the same quotation does indicate that the misfit sees some good in the grandmother, that there is more to her than meets the eye, and that perhaps she could be described as a round character. It's just that the grandmother's goodness is so bound up in her badness that she needs something even more startling than death to shake her out of her flatness. She needs to be shot every minute of her life, not only to be threatened with death, but to paradoxically live in a state of constant death. Of course, getting fatally shot is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of event, so the grandmother's only hope for redemption from flatness is in this brief moment right before she is killed. In this moment, the grandmother's head cleared for an instant, and she says to the misfit, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." The grandmother, who had shown very little in the way of maternal feeling throughout the story, finally becomes a motherly figure. Not having previously demonstrated any expression of love, in the final moment of her life, she gushes not only with love, but with a kind of Christ-like, unconditional mother love for a stranger who has murdered her family. Whereas she had been selfish and secretive all throughout the road trip, the grandmother now opens herself up to another person in an ecstasy of selflessness. In the final moment of her life, it is as if grace finally shines down into the soul of the grandmother, transforming her personality and unleashing the good woman within. Thesis: the grandmother experiences a transcendental moment of roundness in the final seconds of her life. Whether this moment of grace is profound enough or meaningful enough to qualify the ending of this story as a happy ending depends on your own theological worldview. Of course, this reading implies that the misfit is an instrument of salvation instead of, or in addition to, being a mass murderer, which gives us another pair of thesis statements. If we wanted to argue that the misfit is a representation of pure evil, it would be easy to identify his brutal acts, his lack of religious faith, and even his hearse-like automobile as supporting evidence for this point of view. On the other hand, it might be possible to think of the misfit as the lone authentic soul in the story. The misfit's father had said of his son that it's some that can live their whole life out without asking about it, and it's others has to know why it is, and this boy is one of the latters. Whereas most of the characters, particularly Red Sam, are self-satisfied and complacent, at least we can say of the misfit that he is a seeker, a questioner. Notice that Red Sam is happy to agree with the grandmother when she calls him a good man, but the misfit, in response to the same statement, plainly states, "No, ma'am, I ain't a good man." He is aware of his fallibility and his limitations, a quality which differentiates him not only from Red Sam, but also from Bailey and the grandmother. The Misfit's eyes, described as red-rimmed and pale and defenseless looking, also encourage us to consider him as a round character in his own right. A story like A Good Man is Hard to Find hits you in the solar plexus with a violent force that is calculated to jolt you into re-examining basic questions of chance and fate, justice and injustice, life and death, and good and evil. Articulating thesis statements is a valuable strategy for orienting yourself as you negotiate your way among these shifting territories.